So welcome to today's webinar. Great to have everyone here. So we're talking about mapping Germany's risk of imported deforestation, which follows a study which Trase and GIZ have been working on together now for over a year, which looks at mapping Germany's risk of imported deforestation in its commodity supply chains. So I'm delighted to be joined by today's speakers, who I just quickly introduced. So we have with us Lisa Kirfel-Rühle, who is the Deputy Head of Unit of Sustainable Agricultural Value Chains with BMZ. Also Katja Albrecht, who is with the Initiative for Sustainable Agricultural Supply Chains, INA, with GIZ. And my colleagues from the Trase team, Simon Croft, a research fellow with the University of York, Chris West, Senior Research Fellow in the University of York as well, and Mark Titley, a Research Associate with Global Canopy. So I'm Emma Golub, and I'm with Global Canopy and with the Trase team as well, and I'm your moderator for today. So just some really quick housekeeping. We'll be recording this session so that we can share it with you afterwards. And if you've got questions, we'd love to hear from you. We would love to receive lots of questions. So please use the Q&A box for that. And for any media who are present, please do also get in touch. We would love to work with you on your stories about our findings. We'll put an email address in the chat box, but it's media@trase.earth if you've got any queries. So just a little bit more on the practicalities here. So this webinar is scheduled for an hour and a half, but it's actually in two parts. So the first half will be looking at the study itself and the findings, and we'll have a panel Q&A for sort of 60 minutes. And then the second part, the last 30 minutes, will also be a Q&A, but it'll go more deeply into sort of methods and be more technical for those who wish to stay on for an additional 30 minutes to talk about some of the technicalities of the methods that we used. So just before I hand over to the speakers, I'd like to say that Trase is really grateful to GIZ and BMZ for supporting this work. Of course, to effectively tackle deforestation in supply chains and to meet commitments such as the Glasgow Declaration, importing countries need to generally understand the extent and the shape of their exposure to imported deforestation. And so commissioning a study like this one is important and has also been far-sighted as a step towards that. And I'd also just like to say that we're grateful to GIZ and BMZ for recognizing that if countries are to work together on this, that there's also this need to harmonize how data inputs are used in understanding an importing country's footprint, so that we can compare apples with apples and pears with pears, or maybe beans with beans and cake with cake. So just quickly then also just like to ask the Trase team to introduce themselves. So Chris, if you'd just like to introduce yourself before we hand over to GIZ and BMZ. Chris.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, so my name is Chris West. I'm a senior researcher at the York Centre of the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is one of the two main Trase partners, along with Global Canopy. Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy, main Trase partners. My role on Trase is primarily focused around engaging with the Trase data in conjunction with policy spaces and the private sector. So that's me, and I'll be speaking a bit about the key findings of this project. I'll pass to Simon to introduce himself.
Thank you. So I also work at SEI York, and my role on Trase is largely around methodological and technique development and implementation. So creating the models that allow us to map these supply chains and then in turn link impacts of environmental or other types of indicators through to consumption. I'll pass over to Mark.
Thanks. Yeah, my name's Mark Titley. I'm a research associate at Global Canopy, where I work on Trase. So my role is a mix of working on Trase data itself and also helping to communicate that to the people we work with. And today I'll be helping out with the Q&A at the end of the session.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so Lisa and Katja, I'd like to hand over to you now to talk a bit about the context around this work.
Yes, thank you, Emma. And thank you to everybody listen to this real expert presentation. So I'm Lisa Kirfel-Rühle, and I work in the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development in the Unit of Agriculture and Sustainable Agriculture Supply Chains, especially on deforestation, free value chains, and cocoa. And I would really like to welcome you to this presentation of the Trase study, Assessing Tropical Deforestation in Germany's Agriculture Commodity Supply Chains. We were really looking for this data since years, because the last data was from 2017, and we got so many requests from citizens, from political partners, from operators. So it was really important to have this data now, and to work on the deforestation front. And of course, you are aware that up to 90% of deforestation happening worldwide is driven by agriculture, strong connections. So we have bee soy, palm oil alone account for about 60%. And timber, cocoa, coffee contribute another 20%, but is locally very important. If you look at Western Africa, for example, it is estimated that more than 40% of emissions arising from deforestation are caused by international trade in agriculture commodities. So big responsibility by consumer countries, industrialized countries. We need to preserve forests worldwide, no doubt, as they are hosting 80% of plant and animal species. They have an important cultural and spiritual significance and are a livelihood for local communities. So we have a human rights dimension in it. And of course, they are crucial for the global climate and global water cycles. So it's not only a pure emission debate. So this is why the German government, our ministry, and the other ministries are strongly engaged in preserving forests globally and reducing the impact of internationally traded goods on forests. In 2015, we were among the first to sign the Amsterdam Declarations that originally mainly aimed at supporting the private sector in meeting their voluntary commitments to establish deforestation-free supply chains. However, in April 2020, in April 2020, the German government published its federal guidelines on deforestation-free supply chains of agriculture commodities, still guidelines. And then we are currently supporting an ambitious EU regulation on deforestation-free products. So we went step by step more towards regulation, and we think this is the right mix. By supporting Trase, our intention was to understand Germany's role in international trade and consumption of commodity better. And because with greater transparency in agriculture supply chains and the identification of risks in German supply chains, we can reduce our footprint better. It prepares supply chain actors for upcoming due diligence requirements and helps taking concrete measures towards deforestation-free supply chains. And we do currently finance and support OECD FAO to work on a handbook, and we just had another presentation on that, how companies better can implement deforestation-free supply chains. And this study, for example, is again an important element to complementary to the handbook, how to make it really work. And so it's thank you for contributing this, and thank you for carrying out this study. Back to moderation, or to Katja.
Lisa, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Katja, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa and Emma. So I would also like to welcome you all on behalf of GIZ, the German International Corporation, and our Initiative for Sustainable Agricultural Supply Chains, called INA in short. So we are a multi-stakeholder partnership cooperating with multiple actors from policy, private sector, and civil society. And our goal is to improve sustainability in agricultural supply chains. Our focus topics are on our deforestation-free supply chains, as Lisa also mentioned, and living incomes and wages. We are working with producing countries, and our main target group, our main partners in producing countries are smallholder farmers. So our ultimate goal is always to improve the living conditions of smallholder farmers. So the initiative is, of course, supported by BMZ, and we have supported the Trase team. We have now cooperated for more than a year. As Emma mentioned, we exchanged. First, the Trase team took up its work in May and started by revising its methodologies, consulted stakeholders on their methodologies. As many of you may know, Trase is a supply chain transparency initiative that reveals trade relationships linked to agricultural commodities, but mainly forest risk commodities, and reveals the relationships that consumer markets have with deforestation hotspots in certain tropical countries. It mainly uses publicly available data on production and trade, but you will hear more from the Trase team itself on their work and how they develop their methodologies. The study that we will hear about in a minute, it reveals the different roles that German actors take in international trade of agricultural goods, sometimes just as an importer, a trader or processor, or a consumer of final goods. And sometimes Germany imports products, raw materials or derived products directly from the producing countries, and sometimes the goods arrive via trading partners. So depending on its role in agricultural trade and the length of supply chains, I think we have also different possibilities to influence sourcing practices, sometimes more direct, sometimes more indirectly via the trade partners. Yes, I think I will leave it now to the Trase team to really dive deep into the results of this study. And we will be here for to answer certain questions at a later stage. Thank you.
Katja, thank you. Yes, so please do send questions. We'll be able to look at those in a bit. But first of all, handing over now to Simon. So Simon from the Trase team is going to give us an overview of the study. He's going to tell us what it is, what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us, going through the approaches that have been used, the methods and the data sets that have contributed to this work. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you and welcome everybody. So today I'm going to take us through a quick outline of the study and specifically some of the core methods and data sets used, their respective strengths and caveats and what each are telling us. But to start with, I'm going to give a brief summary of what we see as the outcome of this study and how it should be framed, and relatedly what the methods and results do and do not constitute. Next slide, please. So as you all know, no doubt aware now, the purpose of this study is to map out Germany's imported deforestation risk. And firstly, just to specify that whenever we refer to deforestation in the context of this study, we're meaning tropical and subtropical deforestation. But imported risk could mean different things to different people depending on the methods employed and or perspectives adopted. So to clarify, we see this study as a whole as a hotspotting analysis of the key countries and commodities for Germany's deforestation risk in terms of production, but also major trade pathways and commodity flows. In doing so, we are imparting results assessing the extent and distribution of this risk across key regions, while elucidating the major drivers and linkages. This provides a starting point for subsequent research and analysis. Although this study and its focus is obviously German-centric, that is not the case for the core methods, which are geography agnostic, and rather here we are just applying them in the German context. As a consequence, the methods and their application can also provide a means of comparing risk across different countries, both from producer and consumer perspectives, and therefore helping to understand Germany's place in this broader global landscape. So when we talk about Germany's imported risk, as said, this can mean different things. And in this study, we're trying to understand Germany's role, not just as a final consumer, but also as an intermediary between production impacts and ultimate consumption. A synthesis of results from different methodological perspectives, as mentioned, some of which are novel and developed for this study, and certainly this level of comparison across different methods is a first to our knowledge, demonstrates how these results provide contrasting information and alternative assessments. In sum, these methods and results provide a more holistic understanding of Germany's tropical deforestation exposure driven by its trade and consumption activities. Next slide, please. So to quickly clarify a couple of things that we do not think this study constitutes. Firstly, this is not a traceability assessment for Germany's imports and consumption, which is to say the results are not purely representing information providing a concrete link between production taking place in one location and Germany's consumption. Rather, across the different methods and approaches, there are varying modelling requirements, assumptions, etc., and thus the results do not constitute traceability, but rather our best estimates of material flows and their associated risks in the absence of explicit data to answer the questions at hand. Likewise, we are not providing a definitive measure of Germany's deforestation risk. The different approaches view the issue of Germany's impact through contrasting lenses and consequently provide contrasting results, all of which have their own value and validity. As such, a definitive assessment is hard to define, let alone execute, though we have tried to be as comprehensive as possible at this stage. Next slide, please. So we only have time for a very high-level overview of the different methods employed in this study, and I'll give a quick introduction to each of them shortly and cover key points of them. But in simple terms, we've adopted three main approaches for mapping the commodity flows. The first of these is an assessment of direct trade, which looks at reported trade flows to Germany. We then take a perspective considering indirect trade, utilizing implicit information in the trade data to account for more complex pathways to, via, and also from Germany. Finally, we take what is termed a consumption-based approach, which attempts to capture all production to consumption flows associated with German consumption activities. Next slide, please. So these methods represent ways of linking production to Germany's consumption activities. But if we're wanting to understand the deforestation risk associated with this consumption, then we need to convert these flows of commodities into production-driven deforestation risk. This is achieved through the use of deforestation risk indicators, which provide intensities associated with localized commodity production. In this study, two such indicators are employed. At the national scale, we utilize the data of Florence Pendrell and her team, and at the subnational scale, we utilize Trase's own deforestation indicators. The Pendrell dataset offers broader coverage in terms of geographies, commodities, and temporal scale, but has relative accuracy limitations due to generally attributing spatially explicit estimates of deforestation to crops in a non-spatially explicit way, instead attributing based on relative national crop expansion. That is, it isn't typically considering where in a given country crop production taking place and thus its intersection with deforestation, but rather is implicitly making national level assumptions about homogeneity. Conversely, Trase's approaches combine high-resolution remote sensing data for deforestation and crop maps, as well as accounting for lags in land conversion and the backdated attribution of deforestation to crop production. And so both where the deforestation and where the crop production is taking place are taken into account, along with other crop-specific aspects of the production system. However, this accuracy comes at the expense of limited coverage. As such, both methods have their place and each are utilized as appropriate with the different methods employed within this study. Next slide, please. So moving back to these core supply chain mapping methods that we've employed, the first of these is direct trade analysis, and it concerns itself with the trade of commodities being reported as coming to Germany. So an example of direct trade in this context might be Brazil reporting the export of soybeans straight to Germany. This method covers both primary commodities, for example, soybean and wheat, etc., but also directly derived commodities such as soy oil or wheat flour, with the derived commodities converted to primary equivalent mass via appropriate equivalence factors. Deforestation risk is then applied based on primary equivalent commodity production in the countries of export. This provides a relatively quick and simple measure, but when attributing deforestation risk, it's implicitly making the assumption that the exporting countries of both primary and derived commodities are the point of production of the associated primary commodity, which will often not be the case. Next slide, please. A subnational direct trade perspective with associated deforestation risk is provided by data directly from the Trase platform. The core approaches employed here are well established and documented, with detailed methods for each country commodity context found on the Trase website. Next slide, please. So as said previously, these direct trade assessments make assumptions about, or at the very least are not addressing the issue of, indirect trade. Now, not all trade to Germany is direct. Commodities can be traded via intermediaries which re-export the commodities to Germany, whereby re-export, we simply mean a country is exporting something it's previously imported. So for example, Brazil might ship soy to the Netherlands, which then in turn is exported to Germany. Likewise, Germany itself can and does act as a re-exporter, and so is not necessarily the final destination of trade. Here we take the trade data, and then after careful balancing with other data on production and supply utilization, run it through established methods for resolving these re-export pathways. That is to say that we correct for re-exports within the trade data to provide origin to destination representations of the flows. So going back to our example, Brazilian trade of soy to Germany via the Netherlands will be resolved to a Brazil to Germany flow. Again, we incorporate primary and derived commodities, but this time with explicit linkages back to the primary production established, to which the deforestation risk is subsequently attributed, i.e. Brazil exporting raw soy to the Netherlands, where it is crushed and then exported as soy cake to Germany, will have this flow of cake correctly linked back to Brazilian soy production and thus deforestation risk. As well as addressing indirect flows upstream, this step also accounts for flows of imported goods to Germany subsequently being exported in the same or derived forms. The result is better risk attribution to points of origin, but also accounting for Germany's role as an intermediary. Data from specific trace contexts were also utilized and incorporated into global trade datasets, preserving the trace source data within the broader global trade system. This redistributes trace flows downstream of first country of import to provide re-export corrected subnational flows. And then finally, as well as resolving these pathways, we applied novel techniques to unpick and elucidate key trade flows to, through, and from Germany. That is, rather than just resolving the re-export flows, we decompose these pathways to explicitly provide information on the other countries involved. This highlights key upstream intermediaries as well as downstream destinations, i.e. the role of intermediaries in supply in Germany, but also Germany's role as an intermediate link between production and consumption. Next slide, please. The last methodological approach adopted is the application of our input-output trade analysis framework. Financial MRA models offer representations of the global economy, detailing sales and purchases between sectors and economies and to final demand. Standard methods allow for these data to be used to calculate upstream dependencies driven by consumption activities. However, they suffer from limited resolution. IOTA is a hybridized framework utilizing both physical production, trade, and utilization data, along with financial MRAO databases. And this hybridization offers the benefit of higher geographic and commodity resolution, along with full supply chain coverage. The re-export results act as an input into the MRAO component of the framework, and we are consequently able to then model all flows downstream from the point through to final consumption. So as an example of a supply chain this could capture, we might have Brazilian cattle reared and slaughtered, with the hides exported to Italy, where the leather is used to make car seats, which are then traded to Germany and ultimately sold within a car. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we've adopted 3 core methodological perspectives. The simplest of these offers limited supply chain coverage, but provides a much more directly data-derived picture and does so with relative ease, albeit with certain limitations and caveats. Subsequent methods extend the coverage of the supply chain, as well as the commodity linkages inherent in these, with the consumption-based approach effectively offering a model of full supply chain coverage across all forms of consumption. The trade-off is increasing reliance on modeling steps and associated assumptions and a corresponding level of complexity, effort, and loss of tractability. Each approach offers a different perspective with none right or wrong, but together they provide a more holistic assessment of risk exposure, with combined results providing a more nuanced and complete picture. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much. And yeah, just to remind everyone that the last 30 minutes of this whole webinar session will be to go in detail into what Simon's been explaining, as well as the findings. So plenty of opportunity to ask lots of technical questions of Simon about this. So we're just going to take a bit of a break and run a poll. So we would love to hear from you on this. So the question is, which commodity do you think is linked to the most imported deforestation risk for Germany? Is it beef, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, or soy? You can only choose one. So if you could do that now, we'll run the poll and then we'll show the results in a few seconds. And while everyone's doing that, just a reminder also to send questions in the Q&A. So in advance of the technical Q&A, we will have a sort of broader panel discussion in the first half of this webinar. So plenty of time to ask questions still. So please pop them in the Q&A box. So do we have the results? I think it's closed. There it is. Can everyone see this? So soy. About half of you think that it's going to be soy. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Chris then, who's going to present the key findings from the report, including the answer. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everybody, again. So as mentioned, I'll be presenting some of the key findings of this project in terms of Germany's tropical and subtropical deforestation risk. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Athena. Thank you. So here just to start then are some of the sort of headline takeaways. So the first one to note is that if we look across the 3 most recent years for which we have data, which is 2016 to 2018, and if we adopt the perspective of estimating the tropical and subtropical commodity deforestation risk linked to the direct trade flows that Simon was talking about into Germany, then we estimate that about 58,500 hectares of deforestation are actually linked to Germany, which is an area about 2/3 the size of Berlin. Now, however, if we switch perspectives now and take into account all of the agricultural production that takes place to meet Germany's consumption activities, we see that the risk is actually over twice as high from this particular perspective. And this is actually not a hugely surprising result for most developed countries who tend to be heavily dependent on materials that are produced and processed overseas before being imported via those more indirect pathways that Simon was mentioning. So I'll also in a moment take you through some of the numbers and trends in more detail, but another key result is that whilst from direct and re-export adjusted trade perspectives, Germany's commodity deforestation risk appears to have been declining over our time series. This is not something that's apparent in our consumption-based estimates that have been remaining relatively stable over the most recent years of our time series. So if we go to the next slide. So we had the poll results, and those were that it was soy chosen as the most, well, you thought was the most important deforestation risk commodity for Germany, followed by palm oil, and then beef in a distant third place, and nobody voted for cocoa. Actually, this was sort of an unfair question, because the answer to this is actually that there isn't one simple answer on this, and it does depend on the perspective that we adopt in terms of Germany's role in its linkages to these deforestation risk commodities. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just to summarize what we found then from across our 3 perspectives, well, actually from a direct trade perspective, just taking into account those direct trade flows to Germany, it was clear from our analysis that actually it was soy and palm oil that have been typically in the top 2 most significant deforestation risk commodities from a German perspective in terms of their relative contribution to tropical and subtropical deforestation. And these have actually vied a little bit for position in first and second place over the time series. What we actually saw more recently from the data, though, was that coffee has actually been linked to a larger direct trade deforestation risk overall than either of those 2 commodities. Now, from our re-export adjusted perspective, soy is again an important risk source, and this is particularly linked to imports of soybean cake. And we also see palm oil again being very prominent. And it's actually likely we've slightly underestimated the role of palm oil within our data because of some of the some data mismatches in the trade records, which will mean that we are unable to resolve some of that palm oil trade back to its source. So we actually have an unknown component of risk there also. Now, the re-export adjusted trade perspective also throws up a somewhat unusual commodity as being of potential interest, and that's of cashew nuts. From a consumption-based perspective, palm oil and beef actually increase in the relative importance, reflecting their role in the more indirect supply chains into Germany. And we also see other sort of unusual suspects arising in the risk profile, including commodities such as rice, maize, cassava, which are produced in large quantities in deforestation fronts. And whilst those are not closely linked to Germany via more direct forms of trade, they may have some connection to Germany's consumption risk via those complex international supply chains that the consumption-based approach tries to capture. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So here we have a visual summary of the data, which really underlines the comments that I've just made. So for reference, all of these charts here are derived from deforestation estimates from the Pendrell data set, as those provide the global coverage. Bars show deforestation risk in hectares, and the black lines in these charts show the trade volumes. Now you'll note from all of these charts, apart from the consumption-based perspective, that there is this decrease in deforestation risk. So we have a decrease in deforestation risk for Germany from direct and re-export perspectives, but a more stable time series for the consumption-based perspective. We can also see here the important role of soy and palm oil throughout all three of those perspectives, but with beef, for example, increasing in prominence dramatically in the consumption-based perspective, which is shown in red in those charts. And again, in the consumption-based perspective, we can see those other commodities which don't typically get so closely associated with either Germany or indeed more broadly in the EU deforestation risk profiles. They're clearly not as significant as the usual kind of commodities like palm oil or soy, but they're there in the risk profile nonetheless. So if we go to the next slide, please. So that's the sort of commodity overview. But what about the source regions for this deforestation risk? So if we go to the next slide, well, here we can see the same deforestation risk profiles as before, but now these are broken down into source countries where the deforestation risk originates. In other words, this is where the primary commodities are harvested. So there's probably no big surprises here. We have Brazil, Indonesia, Paraguay, and Malaysia appearing quite prominently, and those are associated with commodities such as soy, beef, and palm oil. Colombia, however, is worth highlighting here, which you can see in dark green, and that's become a key source of risk for Germany in more recent years, and is linked particularly to coffee and palm oil imports into Germany. So if we go to the next slide. So those results provide the sort of high-level overview of Germany's commodity deforestation risk. But how do those results compare to other important countries? So we undertook some comparison of results with other countries in this study, in particular comparison with the Amsterdam Declaration partnership countries, and also with China, given its important global role in the supply chains of deforestation risk commodities. So if we go to the next slide. So from these results, and again, perhaps unsurprisingly, if we look at panel A, we can see that China has the largest total deforestation risk of any individual country across any of the three perspectives. And that just is a simple reflection of the relative size of the Chinese economy, really. But if we dig a little deeper, we can see some interesting things going on. So firstly, from a direct trade perspective, it's the Netherlands that has the largest deforestation risk of the ADP countries. But that's not the case from the consumption-based perspective. And this reflects the role of the Netherlands as a key importer and processor of important commodities such as soy and palm oil. But its consumption-based risk is relatively lower because it then acts as an exporter of those materials to others. Now, in addition to the Netherlands, Spain also has a larger direct trade risk than Germany. So actually, if we switch to the consumption-based perspective, it's actually Germany which has, of the ADP countries, the largest deforestation risk, with over 229,000 hectares of deforestation associated with the German economy in the period 2014 to 2018. And that compares with about 189,000 hectares for France and 162,000 for Italy. If we look at panel B, which should just appear, we can see that Germany has a somewhat more favorable deforestation risk intensity. So this is the amount of deforestation per ton traded or consumed. And it's actually, the deforestation intensity of Germany is actually quite similar to the UK's intensity, and it's notably less intense than the Netherlands' intensity. However, it's also somewhat higher than China's risk intensity from the re-export adjusted or consumption-based perspective. So a bit of a mixed picture there. If we go to the next slide. So in our final report, we go into quite a lot of commodity-specific detail around the deforestation risk data, and I invite you to take a look at the sections of that report that you're interested in for more details. But just to draw out a few things quickly that are kind of more notable from our data. So if we go to the next slide, here we have Germany's soy deforestation risk. So this is deforestation risk associated with the soy supply chain specifically. And again, this is derived from deforestation data from the Pendrell data set. We can see here that actually for soy, the deforestation risk has decreased across all three of the perspectives analysed, which is encouraging from a German perspective. We can also see that Brazil and Paraguay are the two largest and most important sources of this soy deforestation risk. And Paraguay in particular is quite volatile from a direct trade perspective. You can see it moving up and down in the risk profile over time there. So quite a sort of uncertain or volatile area of risk there from a German perspective. If we go to the next slide, please. One of the things we've also done for selected commodities in our analysis is to drill into the subnational risk information, where we have this from the Trase platform. So the figure on the left shows the deforestation risk associated with soy, again, exported directly to Germany. And this is summed across 2016 to 2018. And this information is the sort of information that people have been able to access from our Trase platform for several years now. It illustrates in this case that Germany's soy deforestation risk from a direct trade perspective is particularly concentrated in a few municipalities within the Mata Piba region of Brazil. However, what we've also done for this report and project, which is a bit newer for Trase, as Simon was describing, is to adjust the Trase data also to account for these re-export flows into downstream countries. And so now for Germany's trade, but accounting for imports taking place via intermediary countries, we can see on the right that the risk profile broadens a little bit geographically. And actually this broadening for Brazilian soy, whilst it is there, is not too significant, which suggests ultimately that Germany's trade partners are in this case also associated with a very similar pattern of risk as Germany itself. If we go to the next slide, we've also done this analysis for the Trase palm oil data, which at the moment is only available for the year 2015, but we are in the process of updating that very soon to later years. Now, in contrast here to the Brazilian soy case, we can see that when the palm oil data is adjusted for re-exports, the geographic distribution of risk for Germany is quite markedly changed. So Germany's risk after re-export adjusted steps have been made encompasses many districts in the Kalimantan region of Borneo that do not appear in the direct trade results. So in this case, it appears that important intermediate trade partners for Germany are sourcing with a somewhat different profile than for Germany's direct trade. If we go to the next slide, please. And here, finally, we have cattle deforestation risk, again, switching back now to the national scale with Pendrell deforestation data. And a couple of things I wanted to draw attention to here. Firstly, the deforestation risk is actually increasing in more recent years in the time series. And secondly, in addition to the fact that from the consumption-based perspective, we have a larger footprint here, a larger absolute risk overall, we also have a number of additional countries appearing in the profile. So a lot more countries are linked to Germany's risk from a consumption-based perspective via those indirect supply chains than would be from a direct or re-export adjusted perspective. Next slide, please. So finally, another component in the analysis conducted in this study is that we've been assessing the role of Germany within these global supply chains. And this is where the re-exports decomposition or deconstruction that Simon was talking about comes in. So here, for example, are some results for cocoa. And this diagram illustrates that a significant amount of cocoa beans are flowing into Germany from the Côte d'Ivoire. And cocoa is also coming from places not shown, such as Ghana, Nigeria, and so on. But as well as coming directly into Germany from the Côte d'Ivoire, cocoa beans are also coming through the Netherlands and Belgium. And for derived commodities such as cocoa paste, again, the Netherlands appears as an intermediary, but so do countries, for example, such as France. If we go to the next slide, we can see that also Germany processes a lot of cocoa beans domestically before exporting their derivatives. And we can see that countries such as Belgium, the Netherlands, and France are destinations for those materials. So for example, we estimate that Germany actually exported around 16,000 tons of cocoa paste to Belgium in 2018, which remained in Belgium, but the Netherlands and France may also have acted as further destinations for several hundred tons of that production. And countries further afield, such as the US, may also be destinations for this trade, as illustrated by the diagram on the right, where the US is importing cocoa powder via France that is originally attributed to that processed in Germany. So in other words, to summarize there, other countries have an important intermediary role in Germany's overall deforestation risk exposure, and Germany via its exports is likely to play an important role in determining other countries' overall risk as well. So next slide. So in addition to our project report, we've also created an online insight to allow users to explore some of this information with an example for soy. And we have given an example from across 3 supply chain perspectives. We just show it quickly, a screen grab of part of that interactive insight, which illustrates the role of the re-export relationships in the German supply chain. So if you could start the video, here you can see the user identifying the US as a key source of soybean into Germany via direct trade pathways, but also the role of the Netherlands as an intermediary in soy sourced from Brazil, with over 200,000 tons of soybeans arriving this way in 2018. And users can also look at this from the perspective of derived commodities such as soybean cake. Much of this material is reaching Germany directly, but again, large portions of this material is reaching Germany via the Netherlands and some other countries. So actually over 400,000 tons of soybean cake, in fact, in 2018, from Brazil came via the Netherlands, according to our estimates. And finally, we can see also the role of Germany as an exporter of soybeans in much smaller quantities, but with Portugal being one of several destinations. So if we go to the final slide, you can find out more about this on our website, www.trase.earth. There is a lot of detailed information also in our project report, and I'd really encourage you to take a look at that for a full overview and in-depth understanding of our results. As I mentioned, we've only had time to sort of skim through those today. But this report is also accompanied by extensive methods details, and those are relatively important for understanding the challenges associated with trying to bring some of this data together. Please do also explore our interactive insight, and finally as well, we are releasing and have released 2 explainers which provide a summary overview of the perspectives adopted for this study and the methods underpinning pendulum and trace approaches to deforestation risk. And with that, I thank you for listening and pass back to Emma.
Chris, thank you, and impressive to see it in 10 to 15 minutes after all the work that's gone into it and all the findings that are in the report. So great, thank you. And now we'll open up to questions. So we've got now about 15 minutes for a panel Q&A. So welcome all the speakers back to the floor. If you could turn your cameras back on, and then we'll run through some questions. So please keep them coming in the Q&A. We're just going to start off with a question also for, a question first for Elisa and Katja, and then a follow-up for the Trase team. So thinking about this report and the reasons that you outlined as to why it was commissioned and what you were looking into, how is the study now helpful in sort of identifying those priorities for addressing these risks of imported deforestation? So Katja and Elisa, great to hear your thoughts on what happens next.
Yes, I can start. So, of course, as part of the initiative for sustainable agricultural supply chains, we are in contact with many stakeholders from the public, private sector and civil society. And we do intend to bring the results to the commodity specific platforms again and discuss in detail what we can learn in terms or related to palm oil, for example, in more particularly, or coffee or cocoa. So we will look in detail in it together with mainly actors from the private sector. And of course, it will help or can contribute to the risk assessments that importers here in Germany will have to carry out as part of their due diligence requirements under upcoming regulation. And yeah, on the other hand, we do also work very closely with the partner countries in which the commodities are produced. And we will also bring this to the dialogue and exchanges that we have with stakeholders in the producing countries. Yes, I think that these are the most immediate follow-up actions that you will do.
Well, I think Katja covered both the most important processes. The one hand is our work in the multi-stakeholder context, and the other is support the negotiations of the regulation on deforestation-free products and the implementation. And so if you, because we always have, there are stakeholders who doubt the need of the regulation. And so we, all these fundamental data is helping out here to say, well, no, we can't leave soy out of the regulation. No, please, here we have the recent study or recent data on it. So it's extremely helpful. And as well, we hope that we can tease other countries as well to proceed and to have similar analysis. But it's for our interior work in Germany, it's already extremely helpful. So even it's a European regulation which is coming up, we do have a national debate as we have the national guidelines, for example, and stakeholder meetings on national level. Yeah, thank you. Passing back.
Yes, Katja, thank you. Yeah, and this actually is a good introduction then to the follow-up question that I had here for Chris and Simon around whether this study then could be carried out for other countries, importing countries, and how useful that would be to have those insights also perhaps for other ADP countries and other importing countries. Yeah, Chris, do you want to take that one, or Simon?
I can start and then Simon can chip in. So I think the first thing to note is that essentially the methods adopted here are globally relevant. So we can just essentially change the end consumer in our modelling and in our data sets and run this analysis for the UK or Germany and most other major world economies. There are some limitations where for the consumption-based perspective, it's a bit more coarse than that, but otherwise it's something that's very replicable. I think in terms of the utility of running out similar analyses for other countries, there are a couple of answers there. So firstly, obviously individual countries also have an interest in understanding where they are exposed to deforestation, so that they can put their own policies in place and monitor that over time. So there's a sort of individual benefit to undertaking this sort of analysis. I think more broadly though, actually having analysis that's conducted for multiple countries can help to understand where there is shared risk or shared impact as well. So, I mentioned the fact there that when we look at this from a re-export perspective and look at the role of the Netherlands, for example, in the palm oil trade, we see that there's quite a difference in sourcing patterns for palm oil, but for soy, the sourcing patterns are relatively similar. So in that case, there are opportunities to align around potential shared risk areas and then collaborate to try and address those shared risks, and hopefully that collaborative effort will then have a sort of larger benefit than just individual action. I don't know if Simon wants to add anything there.
I think the only other thing I'd perhaps mention is that as Chris showed in the results, when you start looking across the different approaches, you basically have winners and losers when you take different perspectives. And I think doing this for different countries is just important to understand how the global system operates. You can talk about collaboration, but any individual group of actors trying to act on this and make a change are ultimately operating within a global system. And it's global production, it's global trade, it's global consumption, market dynamics, etc. And I think trying to understand what's happening on a broader scale is ultimately going to be key to understanding exactly where the kind of leverage points are and how best to actually make positive steps and progress towards the sort of more sustainable supply chains that everyone's really wanting.
Thanks, guys. And then just one more question on this then, Mark, perhaps for you, how feasible would it be to update the findings over time? So also to come back to updating that.
Yeah, I mean, it slightly depends on the perspective. So we've taken 3 different methods in this report. So the direct trade, for example, is relatively easy to update, and the consumption-based approach is relatively more difficult. But in theory, all of them are easy to update when we have more information. So this new deforestation data comes through. There was another question about the recency of the data we have available, and that a lot of the most recent year was for 2018, for example, and that reflects the fact that we don't get the deforestation data, and there's kind of a time lag in terms of attributing that to commodities, and also the time it takes to process that data. So there is a bit of a lag there, but we can update that data as it comes in.
Thanks, Mark. So going to try to get through more of these questions that are coming in. Thanks so much for sending them in. So a question here, a clarification, the difference between the total and then the intensity risk, those graphs, Chris, that you showed. Mark, did you want to take that one as well?
Sure, yeah, so that refers to the difference that we showed comparing the different ADP countries and China. So the risk intensity simply takes into account the traded volumes of material involved as well. So we showed that once you account for the amount of material that, say, China is consuming or importing, the amount of deforestation per ton is actually slightly lower than for Germany for the re-export and the consumption-based perspectives.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. So some of these questions are quite technical, and we'll be able to come to those in the sort of second part of the webinar. But I think, Chris, there was a follow-up question for you. Do you want to take about the Pendrell data set and how it compares to the FAO definition? Did you want to pick that question up? Yeah.
Yes. So so this one is really just an important question ultimately, which is how comparable are deforestation data sets that might be used by one study or another. And I think this is where certainly where looking in the report and getting more information around this and how we apply these data sets is important. But just to briefly answer, neither the Trase deforestation data nor the Pendrell deforestation data is fully aligned with the FAO Forest Resource Assessment definition of forests, and this is something where I think the scientific and research community and consultancy community at large needs to think about how we provide products which are developing in closer alignment with those products. And that's also something where there needs to be some investment in making sure that the data products actually do exist to support some of the policy that's coming in. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The other point is that whilst the Trase data does cover some land use change in Cerrado, it's not covered to the same degree in the Pendrell data sets. There's a difference there, and that's why we would say, again, directly comparing results from Trase and the Pendrell data set is not something we'd recommend, and mention that in the report. But finally, Trase has also published recently via the EU Green Party a report which does analyse the potential consequences of broader deforestation definitions and what that means for the amount of vegetation that's not taken into account via different methods. So I'd encourage you to have a look at our website there, our insights page, and take a look at that method if you're interested more in that aspect as well.
Chris, thank you. So a question, Katja, perhaps for you here, that others jump in as well, around sort of the policy response. So Germany could, this is the question, Germany could clean its soy supply chains by sourcing from low risk areas, but of course that wouldn't help the global deforestation picture necessarily, as the so-called dirty soy would find place in markets which weren't analyzing or didn't have the same standards. So how will, how does GIZ or BMZ, how do you propose to sort of address this issue as well, or what would be your response to this question, and where does one start?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a question of whether it is very easy to shift to other regions, to just move sourcing areas and shift to a sourcing area which is not linked to deforestation. So I think it does depend on the commodity and the availability probably of the product, but there is, I think, some risk that a new regulation will lead to clean supply chains for European actors, and that some leakage will happen, and products from deforestation area will move to other or will be sourced by other countries. One approach is to start a dialogue with these other potential markets, such as China, which to my knowledge is also wary of these risks, and there are some steps that are being taken also in China. And the other one is to really implement projects, but also a dialogue with the producing countries to find other ways and incentives to preserve forests in the country. So we need different ways also to encourage farmers to protect natural vegetation in the countries. And as GIZ, on behalf of BNZ, we are also implementing a couple of projects in such high-risk areas, and we are in close exchange with various governments and those in charge in these countries. Of course, it's not an easy task, but we are in constant exchange. So I think, it's a multiple approach on various levels.
Gotcha, thank you. Yes. Anyone else want to add to that, or we'll move through questions? So there's a clarification question here around the choice of commodities. So why have we chosen the commodities that we've worked with, and are there other potentially risky commodities to use? And perhaps in answering this, also this related question about the sort of drivers of deforestation other than agriculture, so looking at mining and infrastructure development, for example, which has also come up as a question here. So any volunteers to take this? Simon?
I can take this one. So in terms of the commodity list, for primary commodities, we've basically taken effectively everything from the FAO database, and this aligns with the Pendrell deforestation dataset, which obviously underpins a significant part of the results. So effectively, we've got all crop agricultural commodities such as crops. There is also the slight exception is sugar, which is kind of included, but it's a very tricky case, largely because you have two commodities in cane and beet, which have common derived commodities in terms of refined sugar. So it is modelled, but not quite in exactly the same way as all the others. And we've basically, the choice of derived commodities, again, was just what was in the FAO data set. And Mark and another colleague of ours spent a lot of time mapping out the commodity trees for this to make all the linkages, which I know he enjoyed. There's obviously beef and cattle, which actually covers buffalo as well, again, as a kind of consequence of the Pendrell data set. And then what we haven't included in this study, but is in the Pendrell data set, is timber, but that's a bit of a difficult case because it's to do with how you classify it, and so that's strictly industrial roundwood. So like obvious emissions when it comes to kind of impacts are around timber. Fishery products we've not included, such as shrimp, which kind of aquaculture can have links to deforestation, mangrove destruction. And then minerals and precious metals and extraction mining. These are things we just simply weren't in a place to incorporate at this point in time, but very much on our radar. And indeed, we're currently working on related studies into that. So in future, we'll be able to extend the commodity list beyond those covered. I hope that answers the question.
Simon, thank you. So unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour, which is the first part of this webinar. So we are around for another half an hour to carry on addressing these questions. But of course, if you would like to or need to drop off now, then yeah, thank you for taking part. We'll send you another link to the report in our follow-up, and also a link to the recording. And we will also be producing over the next couple of weeks a shorter insight that summarizes some of this as well. So if there's the very long report, but there'll also be a shorter insight. And as you leave, we'd be grateful also if you could just complete a short survey about the webinar as well. So thank you to everyone who's just joined for part one. But of course, everyone is also welcome to stay for more questions and more discussion for another 30 minutes if you'd like to. Great, so we'll just push on through with these questions then. But thank you to everyone. So let's see. So there's one question really around sort of market volatility versus the effort to create sustainable supply chains and how to sort of bring those two things together. So where there's evidence in the data of this volatility whilst policy is pushing for sustainability, and how can we marry those things? Anyone? It's not really a methods question, but it can ease us into the technical part of this webinar. Chris?
I can, yeah, attempt to answer it in a kind of accessible way. I mean, it's a really interesting question because I think it speaks to the fact that whilst one can map the supply chains with varying degrees of confidence, that doesn't necessarily give you the whole picture. So just better data on its own on the structure of the supply chain does not necessarily give you a full understanding of the dynamics of these systems. And I think that's where we need to make sure that we're combining this sort of information with more qualitative understandings, but also other data sources. For our data, in terms of our time series, this will reflect these market dynamics in the sense that it will reflect these are based on real trade relationships that have existed in recent history. So it does reflect the outcomes of those market dynamics. What we can't do just based on this data is to explore directly the relative contributions. We can maybe look for signals for where there have been policy interventions or such like, but actually modeling the effects, these downstream effects, indirect effects, is not something that our framework does. There are other methods that could be applied, economic models that could be applied to understand that, but what you typically would find is those then lack the granularity of sources and sinks and specific commodity flows. So there's a trade-off there. But absolutely, it's an important question in that if we address the Brazilian supply chain and shift sourcing, for example, to the US, that doesn't necessarily mean that expansion in Brazilian Cerrado won't still happen given price effects and the like. So there are important implications of the wider market dynamics that need to be taken into account in decision making.
Thank you, Chris. That one. So perhaps a sort of broader technical question here, just about the data that are used across all of this. So how sort of the validity of the data is the question, but anyone wants to sort of comment maybe more broadly on the inputs in that sense. It's quite a broad question, but I don't know if anyone wants to use the opportunity to dig into something particular in the data. Simon, you've come off mute.
Yeah, I'll try. It is a big question, and it's that's not to say it's not a good question either. So there's a whole host of sources of uncertainty and potential issues in the data. So if we take one of the core components of the data as an input into a few parts of this work, which is, for example, the FAO stat data set, which provides data on production and trade, as well as utilization within countries. So what countries are using their supply of a given commodity for. This is a kind of well-respected, well-established data set. It's typically based on kind of official records and government reporting. They do impute and kind of do some sort of gap filling, which they flag accordingly. But an example is if you take the trade data, for example, they provide two sets of trade data. There's import data and there's export data. And if you look at what does a country A say it exports to country B and what does country B say it imports from country A, these things aren't the same. So there's a case straight away where, like, well, actually, you've got two effectively equivalent data sets from the same source which disagree with each other. And this is something that we didn't have time to talk about today in the webinar, but it's covered in the methodology documents where we actually took steps, for example, to reconcile this. So we employed kind of algorithmic methods to quantify the reliability of different reporters and then basically use what we deemed the most appropriate data source for each piece of trade. And if you don't do this, you can run into some sorts of issues. So, for example, Myanmar doesn't report its trade. So if you just pick an export record and say, right, this is going to be our trade data set, well, you're going to have no exports from Myanmar, but you can use import reports from other countries to fill that gap. Likewise, when it comes to the MRAOs, I mentioned that they suffer sometimes from kind of resolution issues. And the MRAOs typically explicitly cover kind of the major economies, which can be very important from a consumption point of view. You know, if we're talking about Germany or the UK, France, US, China. But if you're talking about the production end, often some of the most acute risks are actually not major economies, but they're areas with kind of, for example, you know, critical ecosystems and stuff. So there are issues fraught throughout the data sets, and all of the methods and the lengths we've gone to are basically trying our best where possible to account for these and work around these. So it's trying to account for where there's kind of inconsistencies or gaps in the data. It's trying to work around where there are resolution issues. I could talk for hours on this, but I should probably draw a line on it. But just to say that, yeah, there's all sorts of potential issues. I mentioned in the talk that, you know, the Pendrell data set, as great as it is as a resource, you know, it has its limitations in accuracy. And obviously we're taking lots of different data sets, stitching them together with all sorts of complex methods. And it's not an easy question to answer in terms of how do you quantify this, how confident are we? But what I will say is, I can promise you we've been incredibly conscientious in trying to account for everything we can. And what's more, I think our work will never cease in trying to understand where the uncertainty is and how it kind of can percolate through the systems that we've put together. So yeah, might be one to follow up on. But.
Yeah, it sounds like we need more than 30 minutes for that one, Simon. Thank you. So there's a question here that's come up a couple of times. Chris, I think you might be typing an answer, but we could maybe take it live as well, which is just a clarification on how this, particularly on the consumption side, is measured, and whether it also reflects products which are sold outside of Germany by manufacturers and retailers. So that economic question. Anyone want to pick that one up? Chris, if you were typing, maybe you want to.
I can. I was going to wait for Simon if you wanted to come in, but I can. So yes, essentially consumption, by consumption, what we mean is purchases by either households or the German government on behalf of households, particularly, as well as, you know, investments in infrastructure and these sorts of things. So essentially, we're agnostic as to whether something is produced, processed inside of Germany by German supply chain or outside of Germany by an overseas actor. And it's all about whether that product is linked finally to the consumption of products in Germany by households or government. Now, as Simon was highlighting, this is a modeled process. It's based on economic transactions as well as the physical trade. So we're not doing that at the level of individual products. It's more of the economic system and the purchases across that system that are used to then reallocate those supply chains through to the German consumer. But yes, to answer the question shortly, it does include products that are initially sold outside of Germany, but the kind of common thread there is then that they're linked through in some way through to the German consumption, the German consumer, or consumption on behalf of citizens by the German government.
Thanks, Chris. Simon, did you want to say anything else on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this touches on one of the key kind of things across the three methodologies in terms of not just the complexity of what they're doing, but actually what they're counting or not counting in the results. So when we look at, say, direct imports, it's everything that comes into Germany, regardless of whether or not it stays in Germany. When you take the re-export perspective, you're considering things that come indirectly upstream, but also you're then removing effectively things that then leave Germany. When it comes to the consumption-based account, as Chris has said, what we're ultimately trying to do is link anything that ultimately is driven by final demand, which is household, governments, and then it's also NGOs, I think, purchases within Germany. So any level of complexity upstream of the German economy and within the German economy won't be counted in this if it's then ultimately moved out of the German economy or where it before being sold. So it's capturing as everything in theory, albeit with caveats over the accuracy, but it's only ultimately the things that are driven by the actual purchase within Germany.
Thanks both. And just while we're on sort of these producers and retailers, a question here about whether there's a way to link the data to possibly types of certification or so such as ISPO, or also even further downstream to retailers in this way. Chris, did you want to take that?
Go Simon. Simon, you go first and I can come in.
Okay. So I'll certainly take the first part of that. I think you can take the downstream bit, Chris. So one of the issues is, so if you look on the Trase platform, you'll see very detailed information on these supply chains. So you'll see like the traders involved, and that includes kind of sometimes their commitments, and there's also, you can attach indicators around certification. The slight issue is that when you take this beyond the direct trade perspective that Trase provides on its dashboard and start linking it in with the other methods, is that you're moving further and further away from this notion of traceability and moving more and more into the realm of sort of estimates and modeled mass balance type approaches. And we've always been a bit cautious when it comes to anything beyond what is literally presented in the direct trade perspective on Trase, to include much more than the point of origin in the information. You can do it, but you're doing it based on simple assumptions of proportions and mass balance. And that's fine, but you have to be incredibly clear about what it is and what it isn't. And when you start naming companies, which is then when it comes in, like often where the point of intersection is with certification and stuff, I think that's where you start risk getting into slightly tricky territory and a bit iffy ground to kind of talk about the validity of it. So that would be my answer on that. I don't know, Chris, if you want to add to that, but I'll let you answer the sort of downstream supply chain element too.
Yeah, so and there's a lot of complexity to this particular question of how you might integrate other data on either specific information on particular actors in the supply chain, or indeed certification that might be aiming to mitigate some of the deforestation in locations of production. I mean, fundamentally there we have an issue with the data that's available internationally, in that this data was never designed to account for the quality, if you like, of the products being moved around, environmental or really otherwise. So, if you look at the trade records that we have access to, these don't distinguish between an organically certified product, a deforestation-free product, or anything else. So we're constrained there by the data, in the sense that it's very difficult to link in a holistic and an overall fashion data to certification. Then you've got the other challenge that actually certification obviously can take very many forms, from a credit-based system, which actually wouldn't say anything about the deforestation risk of those individual supply chains, through to segregated supply. Now, on the segregated supply, in theory, if this information was in the public domain, we could link that sort of information through to platforms such as Trase, and then rebalance the deforestation risk or other forms of environmental risk to account for the fact that something's accredited as being deforestation free. And this is something we are exploring with partners on Trase. But the scale of that disclosure is not sufficient. The data structures are not sufficient at the moment to do that. And then, as Simon says, when you start linking this through to the downstream supply chain, you're losing traceability at that end. And then this traceability, adding the certification data, for example, into that mix becomes, sort of filtered out in the downstream end. So this is quite challenging. What I would say, though, in terms of the use of this information, is that ultimately the information that this sort of study provides is, the first cut of where deforestation risk might be from a variety of different perspectives. It allows then deeper analysis of, the level of certification, for example, that's going on in these production systems. You could ask the supply chain to evidence the degree to which certification is part of their portfolios in those high risk markets, for example. So this is a starting point, it's not an end point. And obviously we try and include better information as it becomes available, but it's very challenging at the moment.
Thanks, Chris. A related question, but the other end of the supply chain, so upstream, there's a question here about whether it's practical or possible to connect upstream in all three approaches? So can we use can you connect to slaughterhouse and high risk municipalities using all three of the approaches that have been described in the study? Simon, don't I take it?
Yes, I think this kind of basically comes back to my previous answer. So in theory, yes, you can. Whether it's wise to do so or not is slightly different matter. And I think ultimately the validity and value of doing that is going to probably be somewhat context specific and depend ultimately on how concentrated or otherwise the supply chain is. So if you've got very consolidated supply chains with certain slaughterhouses, for example, being responsible only for serving trade to specific countries, which does happen when it comes to things like halal certification, for example, or just licenses for trade or different certification schemes, then arguably, yes, you could do that, because what you're effectively then saying is we know everything that goes from this country to that country is coming via this specific logistical place, be it a slaughterhouse, a crushing facility, or whatever. So in that case, yes, you could do it, and it would sort of not be it wouldn't be a daft thing to do. But if you've got something that's highly complex, and you've got these very detailed estimations of or assessments of what's going via what to where, and then you start trying to chase that further down. So certainly, I mean, re-exports is one thing, but once you start getting into the consumption-based thing, I think ultimately you risk getting into the point of sort of overstating any kind of level of accuracy you can really assign to the results. And it's probably a bit disingenuous to include that level of detail in it, certainly without some incredibly extensive caveats and careful documentation around it.
Thanks, Simon. Katja, there's a question not unrelated for you in the sense of what's useful and what's actionable. So which measures and actions can be taken by Germany to address deforestation that isn't direct or indirect imports? So particularly at this, we're looking at consumption perspective here. So things like chocolate bars and beauty care products, if commodities are imported at these later stages of the supply chain, what is it realistic for Germany to be able to do? And is it helpful to have, how helpful is this perspective in informing sort of actions specifically around, so neither direct or indirect, but this very much looking at the consumption perspective? Any thoughts you have?
Yeah, I mean, in our multi-stakeholder platforms, there are lots of these consumer goods companies that, of course, say they are at the very end of the supply chain, and it's a challenge for them to really know where products were sourced from. But I think, yeah, this approach has to be, the buyers need to exercise their due diligence and try to find out and talk and engage with their suppliers as far as possible. And that will be a requirement under upcoming regulations. I'm not saying it's an easy task, but it's a doable task. And I think the main actors are the larger traders and importers, who know or who can find out where the products are sourced. That's a direct response, but I need to also, of course, see and exchange more with private sector actors and finding out what else hinders them from taking action. So, but yeah, it's a process that will take some time, but it's doable, I think.
Thank you, Katja. So a question here about land degradation. Mark, if you'd like to take it. So asking, is there a way to also assess land degradation or wider land use changes beyond tropical deforestation? So wetlands, draining, temperate forests as well. So similar to, a question, I guess, about other drivers of deforestation, but now beyond tropical deforestation, thinking about that too.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Essentially, No, there's no reason we can't do that, and methodologically that's fine. The broader question is data availability. So the reason we use the Pendrell data set for subtropical and tropical deforestation for our national level perspective is that it really neatly matches onto the FAO trade data and the commodities. And that means we can do that analysis quite straightforwardly. The challenge really is mapping those environmental impacts like wetland drainage or land degradation onto the production of specific commodities in a fairly reliable way. So if we're able to do that, then there's no reason why it can't be included in an analysis like this. But essentially matching it onto the trade data is the challenge, and that's why we've gone with the Pendrell data set on deforestation that we've gone with here. I don't know if Chris, you want to chip in with anything else there?
Maybe just to add and just reiterate what you said there, Mark, that one of the key data gaps, we talked a lot about the trade data, one of the key data gaps here in sort of global landscape is knowledge about where specifically crops are being grown. So there are some geospatial products that try and model this, and we obviously have from remote sensing relatively good information on where cropland is now, but not really the same level of information on what specific crops are grown in that cropland. So as I said, there are some products that do this, but they're quite dated now. And this is an active research area, of course, to try and improve those data sets. But one thing we have done in another study actually for the UK government is have a broader set of indicators that then can be used alongside the deforestation information to sort of assess risk across the environmental domain, if you like, and that includes things like water consumption, water scarcity. We've got some simple biodiversity measures, and we continue to work on biodiversity as an extension to the deforestation loss. But again, there are challenges associated with that data landscape, not least the fact that we want something that's relatively easy to update and also communicate, because a lot of these things are quite complex.
Thanks. So we're doing quite well getting through everyone's question, but we'll maybe speed up for the last few and just try and get through these final questions. A question on geospatial data and inputs there in terms of what geospatial data is used. Just a clarification on the data sources. Anyone like to take that one?
I can take the deforestation data, but I think one of the sub-questions there was around the shipping information, and that's probably something Simon's a little bit more qualified than me to talk about. In terms of the deforestation information, this varies. So the Pendrell data set that we utilize ultimately uses the forest cover loss data set that comes from the University of Maryland, the GLAD group, Hanson group as it's known there. They utilize that and then do some adjustments to it to account for any plantation use in tropical regions, and then link that through to the crop information. Trase uses a variety of different geospatial information, and that depends on the particular context. What we try and do is use the best available data regionally. So these are not global products that we're using. The reason for that is twofold, or at least twofold. One is that these regional data sets tend to be more specific, more tailored for the local context, but also they're utilized as well, typically, or can be utilized in actual enforcement and legislation around these issues locally as well. So we want to be aligned with that. So we do use geospatial information extensively for the deforestation risk. In terms of shipping data, geospatial shipping data, I'll pass to Simon just to clarify that one. You're on mute, Simon.
Yeah, so thanks. The simple answer is no, we're not using any geospatial information for the trade in this point. However, a colleague of ours in SEI called Javier Godard, he at the end of, I think it's either end of last year or earlier this year, launched a platform called Global Shipping.watch, which is taking all of this AIS data and plotting it. And I have had some conversations with him that it'd be quite a big jump to be taking that data to then incorporate it into the kind of studies we've been talking about today, but it's certainly a really exciting area of research. It's somewhat in its infancy, and there'd be a lot of problem solving, but it's quite fun doing that. I think that would potentially have a huge amount of power when it comes to unpicking some of the supply chains. We're taking sort of the best methods that are known out in the literature, and we've developed our own in the case of the study, but certainly having kind of this per shipment view and understanding where the ships are moving to and from, what's been unloaded, etc., would possibly allow us to make a significant improvement in that area. But yeah, there's a big technical hurdle to overcome. So watch this space maybe.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So a couple of final questions then. One question which came in related to the methods, but also thinking more about market drivers. And is there anything that can be done in the data that's available, the methods that we've used or other methods that we've perhaps not used, that can capture also how market drivers also perhaps cause deforestation in other places of production due to, say, demand for those commodities? So a question here around market liquidity and whether it's possible to identify that soy grown in the US could be in response to dynamics elsewhere, and whether it's possible to account for that in the sense then that perhaps you could never say that any region or commodity from a region were deforestation free if it's affected by these global dynamics. I'm not sure if this is a question that can be answered at least in the approaches that have been applied in the study. Anyone wants to take that one?
I was just going to say that, so in a sense, I think the answer is no in one way, in that the methods and the models we've used, they're not dynamic. They're not looking at things like competing demand. But that's not to say that you couldn't take the data at a global scale and look at, for example, the impacts associated with a given commodity at the global scale, and then create some kind of indicator where you are assigning a kind of an overall responsibility to units of what might be in themselves non-deforestation risk units of consumption. So, you know, the case of soy, if you're consuming soy grown in the US, which doesn't have any association with deforestation, as the question's alluding to, it's part of a global demand and driver for the production, which includes that in deforestation risk locations. So it would need some careful thought, but you could, in theory, reasonably easily come up with some kind of indicator that you would put on that. And I think ultimately that it comes down, that ties in with maybe the elephant in the room, which is consumption. It's not just about changing sourcing, it's ultimately about reducing reliance on commodities that wherever they're being produced are driving these impacts.
Okay, so one final question then. I'm unfortunate that we've not going to be able to go through all of them, but I think we've got through most of them. So perhaps a leading question, almost this one, is there a user-friendly interface where buyers can directly compare deforestation risk of trader X in municipality A with trader Y in municipality B? Mark, would you like to take that question?
Sure. So yeah, please check out our Trase website, where we have a dashboard which you can interact with to try and understand the footprints of particular traders in particular municipalities. So you can select particular commodities such as soy in particular countries like Brazil, and drill down into that information. And we'd love to welcome your feedback on how you interact with that as well. So please get in touch.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And that was a very good question. So yeah, I don't know if anyone with the panel wants to pick a final question that needs answering. If not, we can always follow up on email as well to any specific questions. Chris, was there one final burning question that you wanted to answer?
No, well, there's just one other question on how companies might use this data. We focus a lot on the kind of policy side, so just very quickly, I guess. We do work with collaborations with companies, and what we find is that those companies will have a very different level of understanding of their supply chain depending on how much work they've done on this and also their position in the supply chain. We would see this sort of analysis being a useful first cut, as I was mentioning earlier, for understanding where that risk, where they might be exposed to risk, And then the question is, drilling down into that supply chain data and trying to get better and more granular information. And this sort of analysis can be a fallback where there's indirect supply chains or intransparency, perhaps, for having a complete picture. And we do know that some companies find this information useful. And if there is interest from a private sector perspective in this sort of information, please do reach out for us.
Thanks, Chris. I snuck that one in there. So that's all we had time for today, but thank you very much for all your questions and for being so interested in this work. So we'll follow up with the links as promised to the report and to the recording and also to the other pieces of content that we've talked about. And if you've got further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We've shared an email address where you can reach us. And thank you so much for participating today, and thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you very much for moderating and presenting.
Yeah, cheers.